So Randy Pitchford, CEO at Gearbox, made the news today as he just came out and said this, a tweet which ruffled a lot of feathers, but why? Now, I've seen a lot of gamers take on this, and several channels, but I'm here to offer a different take, an industry take, one which a lot of devs share, and in truth, many of us are aligned with, and I think it's worth expanding on. So, Borderlands 4 releases and to mixed reviews. Was that because the gameplay wasn't everyone's liking? Maybe someone didn't like the dialogue? Was it the characters? Maybe the abilities were lackluster? And with the amount of reviews, some of those might actually exist somewhere. However, majority of negative reviews are around performance. Now, I did a deep dive into this in my previous video, so I'll just summarize it here. The criteria for which to gauge performance is not how well it performs on your system, but rather, do you get the performance promised via the recommended specs or not? A game developer can't solve for every system. There's just too much build variety. This is why they release recommended specs, to inform you that for a smooth gaming experience, if you have this system, run it at these settings for the best balance of performance and quality. And just like in my previous video, if a PC running the game at the recommended settings does not offer the experience promised by the studio, then I will be right there with you, calling them out. The problem, however, is people more so look at recommended settings as suggestions, rather than simple truths. Guys, it's not hard. You look at the recommended settings, you look at your system. Do you have better than or worse than? If worse than, well, perhaps play it on lower settings. If better than, well, then congratulations. You can push some of those settings a little bit higher. I don't know when collectively the gaming community fell so far from grace, to be honest. I think the industry needs to change recommended settings to required settings, as it might alleviate some of the headache here. Now, two things, frame rate and DLSS. First off, for those who have lost their way, this is how a game is meant to be played. This is me running around, having fun, enjoying the game. The problem is, however, this is how most of you guys play. See the difference? The gaming community has become entrenched in dogmatic thinking, and it is ruining gaming as a whole. Going through the Steam reviews, I was flabbergasted and understood immediately where Randy was coming from. Reviews like this, downvoting the game on Steam, essentially calling it trash while also getting 90 frames per second at max settings? Tell me how we aren't playing semantics here. This also just leaves the developer confused, as well as frankly quite frustrated, as we are at a point where your voice ultimately falls upon deaf ears. After all, who cares about the opinions of someone who is clearly never satisfied? The irony of all of this is when everyone talks about the golden age of gaming, and they think back to the games they grew up on, everyone forgets that majority of games made before the PS4 were locked at 30 frames per second. And even as systems grew stronger, majority of games didn't even run at 60 frames per second, and if it did, then just barely. Don't believe me? Here's a clip of Call of Duty 3 getting sub 60 frames per second, a game which sold over 7 million copies worldwide. Were people complaining about performance back then? No. Reviews were about quality of the experience. How was the gunplay, the story, the graphics, etc. Games like The Witcher 3, which is hailed as a generational game, for some perhaps your favorite game of all time. For me, I know it's at least top 5. And yet, when you look at its release, it targeted 30 frames per second. Take a moment and go back 5, 10 years, look at the games you grew up loving, the games you played the most, and look up what its native frame rate was on release. You've probably never done that, and it's understandable, because you simply just didn't care back then. Those games released pre-frame rate counter obsessions. You simply played a game and determined if you liked it or not. Period. For a game to target 30 frames per second today is like begging for the axe. GTA 6, for example, got shellacked for targeting 30 frames per second, and some of you acted like it was the end of the world. GTA 6 is looking to be the most detailed game ever made, that's at least their goal. You could see it in their trailer, so a target of 30 frames per second makes sense. My question to you is this. Is it not better to simply judge a game by how well the experience is, how smooth it feels, and whether or not you enjoyed it? Is it really worth popping a blood vessel and throwing it in the trash when the frame rate dips to 59 FPS? Being so distracted by a number counter that you've forgotten the point of gaming in the first place. I guarantee if you turned off your counters, if you simply played a game, any game, you would have a much better time. I will also bet that if you did this, you wouldn't even be able to tell whether or not you're getting 60 frames per second, 40, or 90. The other thing, DLSS. DLSS has gotten a bad rap, but I think most of you forget. DLSS is there to make up for gamers' bad habits. No one wants to play on low settings. Doesn't matter what system you have, you want to play your game in all its glory. And many of you will set the settings higher than your system can realistically take, let's be honest. So DLSS came along and said, hey, those 30 frames you're getting, what if I can make it 60? No, 90. I know you like staring at those frame rates, so let me help you. At first, everyone was excited, the future of gaming, you exclaimed, until some twit on YouTube made a video telling you it's bad. That video got a lot of views, so other creators thought they might get a lot of views too, so they started making videos on how DLSS is also bad. Until one day you woke up too thinking, DLSS is quite literally the bane of gaming's existence. Right about now you might be thinking, well, DLSS actually is bad. Look at all this artifacting. Let's break this down. DLSS is a frame generator, right? So let's say you're getting something terrible, 20 frames per second, and I'm getting 50 frames per second, and we both turned on DLSS. For the sake of simple math, let's say the goal is 60 frames per second. This would mean I only have to generate 10 frames in 1 second, whereas you have to generate 40 frames. This isn't exactly how it works, but it's simple enough to break down for this use case. So on your system, yeah, it might create some artifacting. The answer? Lower the settings. DLSS isn't a magic bullet, but it is there as an option to boost performance if you so desire. The higher the frame rate you're natively getting, the cleaner it will be. The lower the frame rate, then less so. The byproduct of YouTube's algorithm has been manipulation via pushing rage-fueled content. It's not hard to see. Open YouTube and you'll know what I'm talking about. It's brimming with negative content, and that is what is pushing upon you. But this is why I implore each and every one of you to make your own mind. Judge with proper criteria, and when a studio does not live up to the promise set by themselves, then of course, denounce them. But this hate just needs to stop. I'm here not to farm rage, but rather to fight the manipulation which has been consuming your ideology for years from a majority of creators whose sole purpose was to farm views for money. Now, I don't do this to make money. In fact, I technically lose money each video, but I have a vested interest in the future generations of developers, as well as the future of this industry as both a dev and a gamer myself. To criticize is your right. I implore you to express that right vehemently. And I also implore you to do your own research, to search yourself and understand where these views you have truly come from. Do you really hate a game's frame rate, or have you just been conditioned to do so? Again, you grew up, I grew up, we all grew up playing games, loving games that natively ran at 30 frames per second. Now, when 60 came along, we thought it was a treat. I mean, my goodness, even smoother gameplay. Can't imagine Gears of War playing any better than it already is. I mean, that was at least my thought back in the day. Now, today though, we have an increasingly high expectation in both gameplay and visuals, and some people are getting upset at 70 frames per second, 90 frames per second. If you really need 300 frames per second, go play Minesweeper. Again, preemptively shouting at GTA 6 for a native 30 frame rate while gawking at the details, saying even the bottle sweat, I mean, look at the raccoon! At some point, you gotta realize you can have it one way, you can't have it both ways. One of the biggest failings in understanding the frame rate discussion is the fact that past 60 frames per second, you get diminishing returns. Any novice dev using Unreal Engine will tell you getting your game from 30 FPS to 60 is a lot easier than 60 frames per second to 90 or even 70 FPS in a lot of cases. Every bit of performance past 60 frames per second for a visually high fidelity game is often only achieved via removal. Now, you can only optimize draw calls, shaders, and light so much until you just have to start removing assets and systems. This is why games don't just hit 200 or 1000 frames per second. It just doesn't work that way. I also find it disingenuous for the devs that might still criticize this point regarding performance and engines such as UE5, as more often than not, they're criticizing features which they simply have no need for, yet referring globally to the systems as unoptimized and not worth using, and so on. Games like this, for example, aren't necessarily the poster child for Nanite and Lumen. They're not necessarily the quality bar we're shooting for. And to any dev, think that's pretty self-evident. So it's not always the system, it's more often the developer and its use case. For a game like Borderlands 4 using UE5, due to the visually high bar it is trying to hit, it is absolutely necessary to use these features. Features which, mind you, Epic themselves say target 60 frames per second. So for those I've seen getting plus 60 frames per second and complaining, the game is quite literally in those cases performing better than it is intended. It is surpassing its own benchmark, which should really be the true test here. Each bit of geometry, every effect, costs milliseconds, so whether intentional or not, the results are still the same. There's no magic bullet, no magic button to optimization. It's a fragile balance between graphics, systems, and performance, and each game is going to fall somewhere different on that spectrum. Sure, not every game is made equally, and some games like side-scrollers, low-poly Minecraft-likes, and so on will all reach certain targets easier. And sure, no one ever had an issue running Stardew Valley, but you can't compare the performance of a sprite-based game to games using the full breadth of modern tools and techniques for visual fidelity. Now, there's a debate between graphics and gameplay. Some say they don't care about advanced rendering techniques, others do, and it's a balance each game finds uniquely to themselves. So, to bring this back to Randy and his tweet, I agree with his sentiment. You can cry about it, but it's the truth. Making a game engine is a long, cumbersome endeavor. It's expensive, and few people have actually even done it. You have billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of people, some of the largest companies working on the answer to better graphics and faster games every day. And to be quite honest, listening to a lot of gamers' criticism about this often feels like when you're watching an MMA fight with your buddy, and by the end he scoffs and tells you how the fight could have been won, even though the only physical altercation they've ever had was a wedgie they received in the 4th grade. Now, I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s where most of us had sports dads who played a little ball in high school, maybe college, and we'd watch our fathers yell plays to the TV as if they're Bill Belichick. And I gotta say, this feels very reminiscent of that. Now, if you want developers to listen to you, be coherent, be reasonable. If you're constantly screaming rabble rabble, no one's going to take you seriously. It's scripters like Threat Interactive, for example, who are simply tuned out, and no serious dev or studio listens to him or others like him. Imagine you had a friend who only ever complained, and not even about themselves or what they're going through, but about you. It's like that single friend in the group giving relationship advice. Sarah, you've been divorced 3 times. Just stop. If you're a gamer and invested in games, maybe you don't want to be a developer, but you want to know more, then ask questions. What is deferred rendering, and why use that as opposed to forward rendering? How does anti-aliasing work, and how exactly does it impact performance, and why? How can a stylistic choice translate to optimization, and what does art direction have to do with that? How does a developer determine target frame rate and recommended specs, and what does this all mean for the future of gaming? Just some examples of some questions. The problem is it's easier to complain, critique, and condemn than it is to understand and reason, and thus we are here, in the middle of this unfortunate divide. If you're a developer watching this, I implore you to create your own content to educate gamers and denounce the frauds. More devs need to take a stand in the face of such blatant misinformation, as well as bad habits that have been formed. We need a course correction here, and I implore each of you to create content not just for fellow developers, but for educating gamers based on your vocations, to provide your opinions on games, to anticipate and answer some of these questions yourselves, and in time perhaps we can start bridging the gap between gamers and developers, create reason, and a bright future of understanding. Now I leave you with this. George Orwell once said, "The further a society drifts from truth, the more it will hate those who speak it." I think that can be applied to many facets of life today, and it's something I implore you guys to consider. That's it for this one, and I'll see you guys in the next one.